when the paralyzed girl, even amidst an abrupt bout of coughing and soft cries, continued to clutch her dog firmly. Her parents sensed that something was gravely wrong and rushed to seek assistance. What the doctor did afterward, however, left them all in utter shock. The day Annie was born, a storm raged beyond the hospital walls, echoing the chaos that unfolded within. Camilla clutched Chester's hand, her knuckles white with tension, as she breathed through the haze of anxiety. Moments stretched into eternity, until a brief, strained cry punctured the sterile silence. Relief flickered across Chester's face, but as the nurses exchanged uneasy glances, that fleeting hope dissolved into dread. The diagnosis came swiftly and mercilessly. "Your daughter has Sanfilippo syndrome," the doctor explained, voice gentle yet weighted. "It's a rare genetic condition. It will affect her ability to move, speak, even eat as she grows." Chester felt his world shift beneath him, as if the foundation of everything solid had turned to sand. Camilla's sobs were quiet, tears tracking down her pale cheeks as she held Annie for the first time, her love fierce yet laced with an unspoken sorrow. Years unfurled slowly, wrapped in routines marked by medical appointments and whispered reassurances. Annie's laughter lit up their small Tennessee home, even as her movements remained limited, her bright eyes shadowed by the weight of her condition. Camilla busied herself, making their home as warm as possible, decorating Annie's room with shades of sunshine and soft clouds, while Chester took to reading late into the night, searching for anything that might ease their daughter's pain. One day, at yet another checkup, Dr. Harris leaned forward with a thoughtful expression. "Have you considered a therapy dog? It could help Annie feel more stable, motivated even." Chester exchanged a glance with Camilla. They had heard of such dogs, trained companions whose loyalty and intelligence could transform lives. But Chester's heart sank as he thought of the cost. $15,000, he whispered later that night, running a hand through his dark hair. "We've already stretched ourselves so thin, Camilla." Camilla nodded, eyes red-rimmed but unwavering. "We'll find a way, Chester. We always do." And so their days continued, woven with moments of shared smiles and silent prayers. Until one evening, a headline on Chester's screen stopped him cold. "Malinois in need of home. A second chance for Juno." The article described a Belgian Malinois rescued from neglect, now at the Tennessee Animal Shelter, awaiting adoption before being put down. Chester's pulse quickened. He remembered the long, sun-scorched days in Iraq, the Malinois working alongside the soldiers, their eyes sharp, bodies fluid with strength and devotion. If ever there was a creature capable of understanding Annie's silent fight, it was one like Juno. The next morning, Chester shared the discovery with Camilla over breakfast. Annie sat between them, small hands cradling her favorite stuffed rabbit. "You should have seen those dogs in Iraq, Camilla," he said, voice low and urgent. "They weren't just strong. They were more. Loyal, intelligent. They could sense danger before it happened." Camilla's eyes softened with a hint of hope. "Do you really think one could help Annie?" Chester reached across the table, fingers brushing hers. "I do, and I think Juno is the one." The drive to the shelter stretched on, the miles passing in silence, save for Annie's quiet giggles when Chester glanced back to make faces at her in the rearview mirror. The Tennessee landscape rolled out in muted greens and browns under an overcast sky. They pulled into the gravel lot, hearts pounding as they approached the shelter's door. Inside, a woman greeted them, eyes warm despite the fatigue etched into her features. "You must be here for Juno," she said, leading them down a narrow hallway lined with the soft rustle of fur and faint barks. And there he was, Juno, a lean, tawny figure with eyes the color of amber, shimmering with a mix of weariness and resolve. His gaze met Chester's, and in that moment recognition passed between man and dog. Here was a warrior, misplaced but not broken. Annie let out a small delighted laugh as Juno's ears perked up at the sound. Chester felt a tightness in his chest release as he whispered, "Welcome home, Juno. We need you." The morning sun barely warmed the chilled air as the Hembry family set off on their 2-hour drive to the Tennessee Animal Shelter. Camilla sat in the back seat with Annie, her heart heavy with a mix of hope and fear. Chester gripped the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his calm exterior. Annie, their little girl with eyes so wide and curious, sat nestled against her mother. Though her legs refused to support her, she looked out the window with excitement rarely seen in her small frame. "Are we really getting a dog today, Mama?" Annie's voice, so soft yet full of anticipation, broke the quiet. "Yes, sweetheart," Camilla said, brushing a strand of dark hair from Annie's forehead. "We're going to meet him today. His name is Juno." The shelter loomed ahead, a modest building surrounded by chain-link fences and the distant sound of barking dogs. Chester's pulse quickened as he remembered the description of Juno, a Belgian Malinois, thin and worn, waiting on the edge of hope. The shelter attendant had warned Chester that Juno was days away from being injected with drugs to die humanely because of the center's overcrowding. His past is a testament to neglect. As they stepped inside, the clamor of barking reverberated off the concrete walls. The smell of antiseptic and damp fur filled the air, mingling with a sense of urgency. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes approached them, a clipboard in hand. "You must be the Hembrys," she said, offering a polite nod. "I'm Dana. Thank you for coming." Chester exchanged a brief handshake with her, his grip firm. "We're here for Juno." Dana's expression softened as she led them through a narrow hallway lined with wire kennels. Dogs of all sizes barked, whimpered, and pawed at the metal, but one kennel at the far end stood silent. Juno lay there, a shadow of strength wrapped in fatigue. His eyes, a deep amber, followed their approach, glistening with a quiet intensity. Annie's small hand reached out instinctively, her eyes wide with wonder. "Is that him, Daddy?" Chester crouched beside her, placing a reassuring arm around her shoulder. "Yes, Annie, that's Juno." Camilla knelt too, her breath catching in her throat as Juno's ears perked up, just slightly. For the first time in months, she saw a spark of joy flicker in Annie's eyes. It was fleeting, like the first hint of spring after a long winter, but it was there. Chester cleared his throat, recalling his memories from Iraq, the sharp cries of K9s trained to track danger, the silent loyalty in their eyes. "These dogs," he said, more to himself than anyone there, "yeah, they're fighters. Malinois are built for resilience. There's even a story about one helping the Navy SEALs take down a dangerous target." Dana's eyes met his, understanding lighting her features. "Yes, they're remarkable. And Juno here," she looked at the thin creature whose coat had dulled from stress. "He's got that same spirit." Annie leaned forward, fingers brushing against the cold metal of the cage. "Hi, Juno," she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and fascination. Juno's head lifted, ears twitching as if straining to hear her better. His tail thumped against the concrete, weak but steady. Chester's chest tightened. This was it, the moment he had hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect. He glanced at Camilla, who met his eyes with unshed tears glistening. The silent exchange between them was full of understanding. Juno was the bridge they hadn't known they needed. "Can we take him home?" Annie's voice broke the spell, hopeful and bright. Camilla squeezed her hand and nodded. "Yes, my love. Juno's coming home." Dana smiled, a rare, genuine warmth in a place too often filled with farewells. "Let's get the paperwork started," she said, leading them away. Chester lingered a moment, eyes meeting Juno's. "We're taking you home, buddy," he whispered. For the first time, Juno stood, shaky, but determined, as if he too understood that his fate had changed. As they left the shelter, Annie's laughter echoed through the halls, mingling with the rustle of leaves outside, a promise of new beginnings, hope unfurling like the dawn. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the wooden floor of the Chester household. The faint chirping of birds blended with the rhythmic creaking of Annie's wheelchair as she rolled toward the living room. There, lying on a soft blanket, was Juno, his thin frame now slightly stronger after weeks of care. His fur, once matted and lifeless, began to show a sheen of deep chestnut under the sunlight. Chester watched from the doorway, a small, hopeful smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good morning, Juno," Annie whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. She reached out, her tiny hand brushing over his head, and Juno's tail gave a weak thump in response. It was the first sign of his spirit awakening, and it sparked a light in Annie's eyes that had long been absent. Camilla entered the room, balancing a tray of Juno's medications and a bowl of warm broth. "He's looking better today, isn't he?" she asked, catching Chester's gaze. There was a soft, cautious hope in her voice, the kind born from days spent holding on to fragile dreams. Chester nodded, moving to sit beside Annie. "He is, sweetheart," he said, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And so are you." The first month with Juno was demanding, each day a test of patience and resolve. Chester would often find himself up late at night, soothing Juno's soft whimpers, while Camilla spent her evenings mixing supplements and massaging Juno's sore legs. The house was filled with the quiet sounds of their care, gentle reassurances, the clink of medicine bottles, and the whisper of paws shifting restlessly in sleep. It was during one of these long nights that a bond began to weave itself between the girl and the dog. Annie's laughter, long buried under the weight of her condition, began to break through in soft bursts. "Juno, watch this," she would say, pushing herself off the couch to propel the wheelchair forward with surprising agility. Juno's ears would perk up, his eyes following her every movement as if willing her to go further, faster. Chester watched this transformation with awe. One afternoon, as he was cleaning the garden, he glanced back through the window and saw Annie on the floor. For a split second, panic surged in his chest, until he noticed Juno beside her, his nose nuzzling her hand as she giggled, attempting to scoot herself forward on her palms. "Look, Daddy," Annie called out, her voice full of triumph. "I'm moving on my own." The sunlight caught the golden streaks in her hair, illuminating the flushed joy in her cheeks. Chester felt a lump rise in his throat. "Good job, Annie," he replied, stepping into the house, unable to hide the pride that softened his words. "And Juno, you're the best teammate she could ever have." Juno lifted his head, a glint of alertness in his dark eyes, as if understanding the praise. He walked to Annie, positioning himself protectively by her side. Camilla, who had just come in from the kitchen, placed a hand over her heart, tears pooling in her eyes. "He knows, doesn't he?" she murmured, marveling at the way Juno's presence seemed to invigorate Annie, pushing her beyond her perceived limits. "More than we ever imagined," Chester said, his voice rough with emotion. As the days turned into weeks, Juno's transformation mirrored Annie's. He moved with newfound strength, staying vigilant, always ready to respond to her smallest command or need. In return, Annie blossomed, her once shy smile becoming a regular sight. One evening, as shadows stretched across the room, Annie reached out to Juno, her fingers entwined in his fur. "Promise you'll stay with me, Juno," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Juno responded by leaning into her touch, his soft eyes meeting hers in a silent vow of loyalty. And in that moment, surrounded by the hum of the evening and the quiet companionship of those who loved her most, Annie felt something shift deep within her. She wasn't alone in her struggle anymore. She had a guardian, a friend, and a piece of hope that flickered steadily through each day. The morning sun filtered through the white curtains, casting a warm, dappled glow across Annie's room. The soft chirping of birds outside mingled with the gentle ticking of the clock, a sound that marked each passing moment with an unspoken urgency. Camilla sat on the edge of Annie's bed, adjusting the blanket around her daughter's frail legs. A smile flickered on Annie's pale face as she reached out to touch the worn fur of her loyal companion Juno, who was curled beside her. "Did you sleep well, sweetheart?" Camilla's voice was gentle, laced with a mother's quiet concern. Annie nodded, her eyes shifting to Juno, who met her gaze with eyes full of understanding. The silence between them spoke volumes. It was a language only the two of them shared. Chester appeared at the door, his rugged face softened by a rare expression of relief. He watched as Juno raised his ears, ever vigilant. This dog had become more than a companion. He was the family's silent sentinel, watching over Annie with a dedication that Chester, despite all his experiences in the field, had never witnessed before. It was late afternoon when the first signs of trouble began. Annie, sitting in her wheelchair by the window, suddenly let out a faint, wheezing sound. Juno's head snapped up, his posture changing from relaxed to alert in an instant. He moved towards Annie, nudging her gently with his nose and letting out a low, insistent whine. Camilla, in the kitchen, looked up with a frown, sensing the change. "Is everything all right?" she called, her voice tight with the sudden fear that often gripped her heart when Annie seemed off. Before Annie could answer, her small body convulsed slightly, and her eyes widened in panic. Chester, who had been organizing the tools in the garage, heard Juno's urgent barking and dropped everything, running into the house. He found Camilla already at Annie's side, pale but composed, while Juno stood next to the girl, his body rigid with purpose. "Her oxygen level is dropping," Camilla said, voice trembling. Chester didn't need more prompting. He swiftly adjusted the portable oxygen concentrator, a device that had become a lifeline in moments like these. The quiet hum filled the room as Annie's breaths gradually steadied. Juno, sensing the crisis had passed, relaxed and began to lick Annie's hand reassuringly. Chester watched with a mixture of awe and gratitude, wiping the sweat from his brow. He knelt down and met Juno's gaze, the dog's eyes unwavering, a silent promise that he would always be there. "Good boy, Juno," Chester murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved her again." Annie's fingers curled weakly around Juno's ear, her voice barely a whisper. "You're my hero, Juno." Camilla sat back on her heels, the fear in her eyes giving way to a watery smile. "We really do have a guardian angel, don't we?" she said softly, looking between her daughter and the devoted dog. Juno responded with a gentle thump of his tail, as if to confirm what they all felt, but seldom said aloud. In those moments, the room seemed brighter, filled with a shared, quiet understanding that transcended words. The evening came slowly, casting a deep orange hue across the sky. Annie and Juno lay side by side on the small cot, bathed in the warm light that filtered through the window. Chester stood just outside the room, his arm wrapped around Camilla's shoulders as they watched the scene unfold. The weight of the day's events pressed on them, but so did an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "We may not have control over everything," Chester said, voice low and steady. "But as long as Juno is with her, I believe she'll always have a fighting chance." Camilla nodded, eyes glistening. "It's more than that. He's not just here for her. He's teaching all of us what it means to fight, to hope." Inside, Annie's small hand rested on Juno's thick fur, and the rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing matched the steady pulse of his companionship. As the stars blinked into existence, there was an unspoken promise in the room, a testament to loyalty, love, and the kind of hope that grows quietly but powerfully, shared between a girl and her four-legged guardian. The first signs crept in quietly, like an uninvited whisper in the night. Camilla's observant eyes, keen from years of nurturing Annie, noticed it first. Juno's once bright amber eyes now glistened not with playful energy, but with a weariness that sent shivers down her spine. The loyal Malinois, who had become Annie's steadfast shadow, began to lose interest in meals, choosing instead to lie silently by Annie's chair, the thump of his tail gradually fading into stillness. "Mom, why isn't Juno eating?" Annie's small voice, fragile yet curious, cut through the air one morning. Her tiny hand rested on Juno's head, fingers threading gently through the short, brindle fur. Camilla exchanged a worried glance with Chester, who stood near the window, sunlight sharpening the deep lines of concern etched across his face. "I'm not sure, sweetheart," Camilla replied, forcing a reassuring smile. But inside, dread unfurled its cold tendrils. The room seemed too quiet, too heavy, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Chester's military instincts, once honed under the blistering sun of Iraq, recognized a battle on the horizon. "We need to take him to Dr. Wilson," he said, his voice steady but shadowed with worry. Without hesitation, the family gathered what little hope they had left and prepared to seek answers. The veterinary clinic hummed with the sterile scent of antiseptic and distant muted whimpers. Dr. Wilson, an older man with silver-streaked hair and eyes that spoke of years of hard truths, greeted them with a somber nod. Chester held Juno's leash with a firmness that belied the tremor in his hand, while Annie leaned into Camilla's side, her eyes wide and searching. "Come in, let's see what's going on," Dr. Wilson said, gesturing to the examination room. Juno followed obediently, his movements slow, each step echoing the weight of an unseen struggle. As the minutes ticked by, silence turned oppressive. Dr. Wilson moved with practiced precision, the rustle of his lab coat the only sound punctuating the room's tension. He drew back, face grave, and met Chester's unspoken question with the heaviness of truth. "It's care disease," he said softly, the name landing like a stone in a pond, sending ripples of disbelief across the room. "A rare and serious illness. It explains his symptoms, fever, lethargy. It's a tough road from here." Camilla closed her eyes, drawing in a shaky breath as Annie's hand found Juno's ear, stroking it tenderly. Chester clenched his jaw, memories of battlefields mixing with the fierce, helpless love of a father. "There has to be something we can do," Chester said, the plea in his voice masked by its firmness. Dr. Wilson sighed, the weight of countless failed hopes pressing his shoulders down. "We'll try treatment, but it's aggressive. I need you to be prepared that it might not work," he said, casting a sympathetic glance at Annie, who, though only a child, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Days bled into nights in a blur of whispered prayers and gentle reassurances. Annie never left Juno's side, her voice a soft litany of comfort. "It's okay, Juno," she whispered, pressing her cheek to his neck. "We're here." Juno's response was a slight wag of his tail, a faint acknowledgement of her touch, and it was enough for her. It had to be. One evening, as the sky outside turned a deep indigo, Dr. Wilson entered with eyes that struggled to meet theirs. "We need to talk about letting him go," he said, each word deliberate, laden with reluctance. It would spare him the pain. "No." Annie's cry was sharp, her small frame trembling as she clutched Juno closer. Tears welled up, spilling onto her cheeks. "He's my best friend. He'll get better. He has to." Camilla's heart splintered at the sight of her daughter's grief. Chester's voice, deep and cracked, filled the silence. "Doctor, can we just try a bit longer? He's been fighting for us. We owe it to him to fight for him, too." Dr. Wilson's gaze softened. The room held its breath as he nodded slowly. "We'll do everything we can." And so, surrounded by the echoes of hope and determination, Juno's battle continued, fought not only with medicine, but with the boundless love of a little girl who believed in miracles. The house was steeped in a hushed stillness, only punctuated by the soft rustle of leaves outside the window and the rhythmic beeping of the medical equipment that had become an all-too-familiar sound in their lives. Camilla sat at the kitchen table, eyes glazed with exhaustion, while Chester paced back and forth in the narrow hallway. Every fibre of their being was concentrated on the small figure resting on the living room couch, and the gentle rise and fall of the dog curled up beside her. Juno's eyes fluttered open, as if sensing their silent vigilance. The once sleek, powerful Malinois had grown leaner, but the glimmer in his gaze was still there, a testament to his unwavering spirit. Annie, with her thin arms barely able to support her weight, reached out with a trembling hand to touch the soft fur that had brought her so much comfort. "Juno," she whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with a fragile hope. The dog's ears perked up, and he shifted, moving his head closer to her lap. Camilla watched, her heart tightening at the scene. There was something in the way Annie's fingers twined into Juno's fur, as if holding onto the last thread of a promise neither of them would let slip away. "It's been 2 weeks, Chester," Camilla said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice quivered, laden with the countless sleepless nights spent nursing both her daughter and the dog that had become their beacon. "Do you think he's turning a corner?" Chester stopped mid-step and looked at his wife, his face lined with worry but brightened with a cautious optimism. "I don't know, Camilla," he replied, sighing, "but he's fighting, and that's more than I dared to hope for." As if on cue, Juno shifted and let out a low, contented growl, almost as if he were reassuring them. Annie's eyes, wide with wonder, lit up with a smile so pure it sent warmth spreading through the room. "Mum, look," she said, her small voice carrying an unexpected strength. "Juno's getting better. I can feel it." Camilla crossed the room and kneeled beside her daughter, cupping Annie's face in her hands. "Yes, sweetheart. He's strong, just like you." Hours stretched into days, each moment painstakingly slow yet filled with a tenuous hope. The family had fallen into a rhythm, orchestrated around Juno's care. Chester mixed special meals, Camilla carefully administered medication under the watchful eye of Annie, who always insisted on holding Juno's paw while they worked. One evening, a sudden knock at the door startled them from their routine. Dr. Wilson stood there, his white coat pristine, but his eyes weary from countless cases like theirs. He entered with the professional demeanor that always put Camilla on edge. but tonight there was a softness in his gaze. "How's our brave boy today?" he asked, leaning down to run a practiced hand over Juno's back. His touch was gentle but firm, probing for signs of progress. Chester glanced at Camilla nervously and then spoke. "Better, I think. He's more alert, even wagging his tail this morning." Dr. Wilson's brows lifted, a subtle shift that signaled more than just professional interest. He listened to Juno's breathing, checked his heartbeat, and finally leaned back with a satisfied nod. "Remarkable," he murmured. "He's responding well, but you'll need to remain vigilant. The recovery path isn't straightforward, and there's always a chance of relapse." Annie's grip on Juno's fur tightened. "But he'll be okay, right?" she asked, eyes wide and searching. The doctor met her gaze and offered a small, reassuring smile. "He's got a fighting chance, Annie, and that's more than most have." A collective breath seemed to escape the room, the tension dissolving as if someone had lifted a weight off their chests. Camilla's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she wrapped an arm around her daughter, their shared relief palpable. "Did you hear that, Juno?" Annie said, bending down to whisper into the dog's ear. "We're going to be okay." Juno's tail thumped softly against the couch, a silent agreement that spoke louder than any words. For the first time in weeks, the Hembry family allowed themselves a small taste of hope. The house seemed a little warmer, the shadows a bit less daunting. And as the night drew in, Annie fell asleep with her hand resting on Juno's side, the steady rise and fall of his chest a promise kept between two friends bound by unspoken loyalty. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of the Hembry home, casting a soft glow across the living room where Annie sat curled up beside Juno. The Malinois, ever attentive, rested his head on her lap, his dark eyes glistening with unspoken understanding. Annie absently stroked his fur, feeling the warmth radiate from his body, a comfort in the midst of her daily battles. Chester watched them from across the room, a faint smile pulling at his lips, though the lines of worry never truly left his face. News of the extraordinary bond between Annie and Juno had begun to ripple through their small Tennessee town and beyond. What started as a heartwarming story shared at a local community meeting had now spread to nearby counties. Letters and emails flooded in, each word brimming with empathy and admiration. Chester could still recall the first card that arrived, a simple, handmade note from a woman who wrote, "Your story reminded me of the kindness we should all strive for. Thank you for sharing it with us." The cards multiplied, filling their small dining table, spilling onto the mantel, and even creeping onto the bookshelf. Jennifer would read them aloud in the evenings, her voice steady, yet tender. "Listen to this one, Chester," she said one night, her eyes misting as she glanced at him. "A family in Ohio has a daughter just like Annie. They say that hearing about Juno has given them hope." Chester's heart swelled with pride, tempered by the persistent ache of their reality. He nodded, looking down at Juno, who lifted his head and let out a low, approving bark, as if he too understood the weight of their journey. Annie, although young, seemed to grasp the magic of these moments. "Why do they write to us, Mama?" she once asked, her small fingers tracing the edge of a glittering card. Jennifer knelt beside her, brushing a stray lock of hair from her daughter's forehead. He leaned into Annie, eyes closing as if satisfied that his job, for today at least, was done. Annie reached down, wrapping her thin arms around his neck, her cheek pressed to the softness of his fur. "Thank you, Juno," she whispered. "You're my hero." Chester knelt beside them, his voice low but filled with conviction. "No, Annie, it's you who are ours. But we couldn't have done it without him." The light in the room seemed to brighten, as if the sun itself were celebrating with them. Outside, birds sang with renewed energy, their chorus a gentle reminder that hope, once found, can flourish even in the darkest of times. Thank you for joining us today and being part of this heartfelt journey. The story of Annie and Juno, based on true events, is a powerful reminder of the incredible bond between humans and their loyal canine companions. It shows us that hope, love, and resilience can come from the most unexpected places. If you were inspired by this story, let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and remind us of the goodness in the world. Until next time, take care, and remember to cherish those special moments that make life extraordinary.